Joining us on the line is Nick Loris. He's a fellow in energy and environmental policy at the Heritage Foundation. He's also an economist, and he is the deputy director of the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. Nick, thanks for joining the Ben Shapiro Show. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with this narrative. Al Gore, people, AOC. The planet is on fire. We're all going to die if we don't solve this within 12 years. What is the actual danger of climate change? Is there a danger to climate change, and how much of it is man-caused?
Yeah, there's not a danger. Yes, that human activity is certainly contributing to climate change and a warming planet, but even the mainstream science doesn't say that we're headed towards imminent climate catastrophe. This is constantly cited that the IPCC is saying that we only have 12 years to act. That's not what they said by any means. So what happens is this essentially became a game of telephone where, somebody says one thing and then another person twists it and says something else. And then, a few people down the road, you get to the world is on fire and we only have 12 years to act, when in reality, yes, we're experiencing some warming, but by no means are we headed towards a serious climate catastrophe where the Statue of Liberty is up to her hips in water.
So one of the things that we keep hearing when it comes to climate change is that over the course of the next century, climate change is going to create water level increases around the globe thanks to the melting of the polar ice caps. How much of that is real? How much can we expect? What is the range of expectation? And what are the methods that we can take to protect, for example, major coastal cities?
Yeah, I mean, we've been in a warming period, ever since the end of the Little Ice Age, so it's been going on for, 160 years or so now, and there's been a current steady level sea rise, about 12 to 13 inches per century. And if those trends continue, they're going to be slow and steady, and we're going to be able to protect against that with policies like building better infrastructure and building sea level walls that combat that slow rise in increasing water levels. These are practical, common sense policies that won't cost much, but will do a lot to protect against a changing climate and changing sea level rise. What the left is interested in doing is simply trying to re-engineer the entire energy economy for not just the United States, but for the rest of the world. These policies wouldn't make any difference in terms of mitigating global temperatures or sea level rise. You're talking about abating maybe a few hundredths of a degree Celsius in the Earth's temperature by the turn of the century, and maybe 2 millimeters to 2 centimeters of global sea level rise by the turn of the century. So all of these costly policies, whether it's a carbon tax or cap and trade or something as radical as the Green New Deal, are going to absolutely destroy the economy for a change in the Earth's temperature that's barely measurable.
Well, at what point, we're speaking with Nick Loris, fellow in energy and environmental policy at the Heritage Foundation, at what point, Nick, does climate change actually become a danger? So is there any point at which climate change does become a grave enough crisis that we have to consider these sort of complete revisions to the way that humanity does business? Or is it just that it's a sliding scale, we'll know it when we see it? William Nordhaus, for example, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, he suggested that we shouldn't even begin to worry about this effectively until we have a 3-degree Celsius climate change that we are foreseeing. At what point should we start to worry, and what sort of measures should we take other than shoring up infrastructure, for example? Is there anything that we should be doing?
Yeah, I think one is just getting a better grapple on the science for starters. So there's a lot of literature in peer-reviewed climate journals that say that there's a lot of disagreement as to what the equilibrium climate sensitivity is for greenhouse gas emissions, and that's just a fancy way of saying, what temperature increases are we going to expect from a doubling of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere? And there's a lot of climate literature that says it's closer to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, and then there's other literature that says it's greater than that. But if it's the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, we're going to be in a slow warming period where it's really not all that bad, and we're actually, for the foreseeable, few decades, we're going to see more benefits from a warmer world and greater agricultural yields and those types of activities from increased greenhouse gas emissions. I think when it gets to be a problem, we need to look at policies that are outside the box of simply regulating CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions, because if you look at climate change and you say it's a collective action problem, then you're talking about something that takes global action to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And for the developing world, their priority is to gain access to affordable, reliable power. And right now that means using a lot of fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, and oil. So if you want them to do something else, you need to develop low-cost alternatives. We can do that with increased natural gas replacing coal. We can do that with more nuclear power, for instance, but it's going to be market-driven innovations that help reduce those costs for the developing world.
Well, Nick, when you look at the amount of rhetoric that surrounds global warming on both sides, it seems like on the left it's all alarmism. It's people like AOC claiming that the world is basically over inside of 12 years. And then on the right, you do have people who say that climate change isn't happening at all. How should the right talk about climate change, considering that, as you say, the science is pretty solid that human activity is contributing at least a fair bit of the global warming that we are now experiencing?
Yeah, I do think there's a middle ground, and it's not helpful to call climate change a hoax or just completely ignore it. But I think part of it is pointing to the climate realities and looking what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change science is actually saying. And they show that even with increased greenhouse gas emissions, there's been no increased frequency or intensity of natural disasters, whether that's tropical cyclone activity or hurricanes and tornadoes or droughts and floods or wildfires. So part of it is just getting a better understanding of what the actual science says. And then it gets back to the fundamental point that what the left is proposing is a very costly non-solution to an exaggerated problem. So yes, we need to point out the exaggeration of the claims that the Bill Nyes of the world are going to say that the Earth is on fire, but actually just have a productive conversation about what the climate science actually says, and actually demonstrate some humility as to what we know about climate science and what we don't know. We're still in the very early stages of understanding how the climate is changing and why, and then we can talk about practical solutions that are targeted and make sense both at the local level, at the federal level, and then at the global scale as well.
We're speaking with Nick Loris. He's a fellow in energy and environmental policy at the Heritage Foundation. So, Nick, when you look at the amount of rhetoric on the other side, the idea that everybody who disagrees with the policy prescriptions of the Green New Deal is some sort of climate denier, how would you recommend that folks talk to people on the right about climate change? Because I've seen some people on the left who I think are good-hearted recommend things like we should eat less meat because this will presumably lead to a decrease in carbon emissions through agriculture. What sort of recommendations have you heard from the left that you think might be somewhat reasonable?
One, I think, is thinking outside the box in terms of what climate solutions may actually be viable. Folks have talked about geoengineering as a possibility, and that's not an endorsement for geoengineering, but it's something that could actually be cost-effective and help mitigate changing global temperatures. It could also have a number of unintended consequences, so it's not something we should necessarily jump into, but I think starting to study and look at that a little bit more, as well as looking at some of these negative emissions technologies that look at sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. These are policies that would hopefully kind of skirt away from all of the rent-seeking behavior that you see from the climate-based policies, where you have lobbyists and politicians determining who produces what, whether it comes to our energy sources or our agricultural products. That's essentially what the climate game has become, is how can we benefit from this politically and financially, and then you end up with all of these policies like a cap and trade or carbon taxes or massive energy subsidies that concentrate benefits to a group of well-off companies or politically connected companies and disperse the cost to the rest of Americans. So those are the policies we want to get away from, and we want to talk about productive policies that can lead to more innovation, more economic growth, but also have productive environmental benefits as well.
Well, Nick Loris, he's a fellow in energy and environmental policy at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks so much for stopping by. Really appreciate your time, and obviously a rational conversation about this stuff would be nice. I don't think it's anywhere near around the corner. But thanks. I really appreciate you illuminating this stuff for us.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Well, coming up, we're going to talk